From the mists of Dartmoor have sprung many enduring myths and legends. But one tale remains to this day the most celebrated story of evil and horror on the moor, the Hound of the Baskervilles. Yet it is a work of fiction, a gruesome story about a demonic hound which haunted the Baskerville family. It was the invention of Sherlock Holmes's creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Or was it? Our quest to find the origins of Conan Doyle's Gothic classic took us first to a former chairman of the Sherlock Holmes Society, who for 15 years has been investigating the world Holmes inhabited. For Captain Bill Mitchell, The Hound is a masterpiece.
To start with, it's one of the very few long stories which Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes, and therefore he had all the time and the space in the world to develop it, not only as a mystery, a story in its own right, but to get the atmosphere and describe the scenery of Dartmoor and the legend and so forth in far greater detail than anyone can, of course, in a short story. I think that added to the fact that everyone likes the idea of the spectral hound. It's one of those sort of endearing legends, isn't it? As you know, Conan Doyle killed Holmes off in about 1893 or thereabouts, and he resisted all the blandishments of the publishers to bring Holmes back. Finally, of course, a combination of economics and one thing and another, he couldn't resist it. So in 1901, he produced The Hound of the Baskervilles, 8 years after Holmes was killed. The story goes that he was staying with a man called Fletcher Robinson, who was an old friend of his. And this chap Robinson lived in Ipplepen. And they got talking one night over the fire, and Fletcher Robinson was telling him about this extraordinary West Country legend. And at that stage, Conan Doyle still wasn't prepared to bring Holmes back, but he thought he might write a story just on the legend. And after a while, he discovered the only person who could possibly solve the legend had to be old Sherlock.
Over the green squares of the fields and the low curve of a wood, there rose in the distance a grey, melancholy hill with a strange, jagged summit, dim and vague in the distance, like some fantastic landscape in a dream.
I think if you read some of the lengthy descriptions of the moor, it certainly conveys a very remarkable and exciting atmosphere, doesn't it, of the moor. I think where it's got a bit wrong, perhaps, is that it indicates Dartmoor as being solely an uninhabited morass and the Grimpen Mire and all that, whereas in fact the uninhabited part of Dartmoor, especially, of course, about 1900, was relatively small compared with the farmlands and villages and so forth which surround it. Of course, he changed the name somewhat, but most of the places are fairly readily identifiable from his descriptions. Although there's been a great deal of argument, and always will be, as part of the fun of the Sherlock business, as to where some of the places actually were. But broadly speaking, he got it right.
Nowhere in the novel has attracted as much attention as the true location of Baskerville Hall. Contenders for the role abound on the moor, but a process of elimination leaves only a handful. Surely nowhere could be a more appropriate setting for a tale of the supernatural than this manor house, Luke's Land, near Ivybridge. The Baskervilles are said to have been plagued by a huge hound since the death of the evil Sir Hugo in the 17th century. After chasing a young maiden who had escaped from his clutches at Baskerville Hall, he was discovered being torn apart by the beast. 250 years later, Sherlock Holmes was called in when Sir Charles Baskerville was found terrified to death by a huge creature in a yew walk near the hall. Mr. Brian Howell, the current owner of Luke's Land, is aware that his home bears a strong similarity to the book's description of the hall.
It was built in 1862 by somebody from Plymouth. I don't know, up to quite lavish specifications, as you can see. He overspent, and by 1875, the bank closed in on him, and it had to be sold when it was bought by the MacAndrew family, who had a shipping line. We used as children to be told that Mrs. MacAndrew was walking around when we heard the pipes cooling down in the winter, It was used, I think, in the early 60s by a television filmmaking crew, and Peter Cushing and Nigel Stock were Holmes and Watson.
So was this the setting used by Conan Doyle?
Well, that's obviously pure conjecture. I mean, it could be, especially if you saw it on a misty day, it would fit quite well, but we've not any evidence that Conan Doyle came here, but it is interesting when you think that these trees were planted back in the time that the house was built, and therefore, if he came in 1900, they wouldn't be very large, and so you'd feel much more in the moor than you do now.
In the heart of the moor is what many have claimed is the setting, but the manor house at Moreton Hampstead is evidently not. Conan Doyle published the story in 1902. Shirley Purvis, the current chairman of the Sherlock Holmes Society, has her own favourite.
So I favour Brook Manor. There are many other contenders, but I think most of us realise that Conan Doyle took an area of Dartmoor, which we're pretty sure is the one bounded by Postbridge and Widdicombe and Fernworthy, and then took a typical Devonian manor and put it in the middle there. And it doesn't actually exist as such in the middle of the area in which the actual story must have taken place.
The avenue opened into a broad expanse of turf, and the house lay before us. I could see that the centre was a heavy block building from which a porch projected. The whole front was draped in ivy, with a patch clipped bare here and there, where a window or coat of arms broke through the dark veil.
I think it's quite obvious he explored Dartmoor fairly heavily on all angles, from Princetown really probably right through to Ashburton. He stayed, we know, at what was then the Duchy Hotel at Princetown. He also stayed at Ipplepen, which then one could virtually go straight onto the moor through Ashburton.
As early as 1921, filmmakers had seized on the dramatic qualities of the story. Yet it was not a new story. It was based on a Devon legend, as Conan Doyle's daughter Dame Jean explains.
He was a friend of Fletcher Robinson, who he had met on the ship coming back from South Africa at the end of not at the end, but when they were coming back from the Boer War. And they were staying at Cromer and playing golf. And Fletcher Robinson told my father this legend of the hound. And this was in March 1901. And by the end of the month, my father was down here in Devonshire exploring the moors and getting the atmosphere.
Our search for the origin of the legend took us to the Church of the Holy Trinity at Buckfastleigh. The Victorians had a fascination for myths and legends, and it's hardly surprising that Conan Doyle's friend Fletcher Robinson should have known the stories about the so-called evil seducer of maidens at Buckfastleigh, Richard Cable. Indeed, there are stories which are still alive today, as one of the family, Susan Cable, has discovered.
There are lots of superstitions about the tomb that if you walk round it 3 times or 7 times or 13 times, according to different versions, and stick your fingers through the iron grill, they'll be snapped off by the devil. The devil presumably being Richard Cable, coming back to life. And I mean, even now a lot of people are afraid to go in there. They're frightened of the tomb. There was a very wicked Richard Cable, who had such an evil reputation, and generally assumed that this was to do with the village maidens, that he was buried with a heavy stone on his head to prevent him rising from the grave. And the little penthouse built over his tomb to keep his spirit within its bounds. This, I think, is from the Fletcher Robinson version of the legend, which was told to Conan Doyle. He said that Richard Cable had suspected his wife of being unfaithful and drove her out onto the moor and followed her and stabbed her with his hunting knife, and she fell dead, and her faithful hound then leapt at him, and he killed the hound, but the hound at the same time tore his throat out, and so they both fell dead. I think the legend may have been invented because there was a spate of body snatching from the churchyard in the early 19th century, and I think the legend may have been created to stop the body snatchers or put them off.
It would seem that the Cable family were transformed into the Baskervilles at the hands of Conan Doyle, and as if further proof were needed, their home was Brooke Manor. But was Richard Cable, like Sir Hugo, an evil seducer?
I think the building of the new manor at Brooke, people may have felt this was rather ostentatious, and the building of the tomb, which he built at that time too, 1656, for his father and his grandfather. And people may just have felt that the Cables were getting a bit above themselves. Another thing which may have made Richard Cable unpopular was that he was supposed to have had mistresses and to have kept them at horse and court. But I think he may have been a rather proud, stiff man, but and he may have been out for his own glorification or the glorification of his family by building the manor and the tomb. But I don't think he was really an evil man.
Twice I have with my own ears heard the sound which resembled the distant baying of a hound. It is incredible, impossible that it should be outside the ordinary laws of nature.
The hound is one of the most enduring and frequent images in folklore throughout the country, but it's disputed upon which legend Conan Doyle based his story.
The legend itself, there are legends of hounds, ghostly hounds all over the place. My father always linked it with Devonshire, of course, and when it came to the use of the name Baskerville, Baskerville was the name of the coachman who drove Fletcher Robinson, who lived in Devonshire. And there's no doubt that the name Baskerville was used because of the coachman, and for no other reason.
While Baskerville has been immortalized in literature, little is known today of the man who brought about the writing of the book. Fletcher Robinson lived here at Park Hill near Newton Abbot. Author Richard Lancelyn Green has studied his life.
His father had an interesting career in his own right. He'd been with Garibaldi in South America, made his fortune in Liverpool, and then moved down to Devon and purchased Park Hill. Fletcher Robinson was born there in about 1870, went to school at Newton Abbot, Newton College, then went up to Jesus College, Cambridge. He was a very successful sportsman, a rugger blue. He had called to the bar, but he never practiced, and journalism became his whole career. In 1900, he was asked to go out to South Africa by Pearson, who was just establishing the Daily Express. And it was there that he met Conan Doyle, or that their friendship was cemented. He'd probably met him before.
Fletcher Robinson was already an accomplished writer of detective stories, so it was natural he should discuss the plot of the new novel.
It's not known for certain what his contribution was, but it was clearly quite extensive. One must assume that he provided the legend, which forms a whole chapter of the book, and also undoubtedly helped Doyle working out the plot. It's one of the most successful of Conan Doyle's books for the complexity of the plot and for the various threads, and Fletcher Robinson already by then had a reputation for the creation of intriguing plots. Conan Doyle certainly insisted that Fletcher Robinson's name should appear with his own when he wrote to the editor of the magazine in which it was going to appear. And from Doyle's account books, one can see that he was paying Fletcher Robinson. They were paid in a proportion of 25% to Fletcher Robinson and 75% to Conan Doyle.
Fletcher Robinson died of typhoid at 35, but the story lived on, and interest in Sherlock Holmes flourishes.
Sherlock Holmes has given rise to an enormous quantity of scholarship, or Sherlockian scholarship, which is treats Sherlock Holmes almost as if he was a real person. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it played seriously. Dorothy Sayers was one of the early scholars, Sherlockian scholars, who said it should be played like a game of cricket at Lord's, or as seriously as that.
We call it the writings about the writings. It was started in 1951 at the Festival of Britain. The Marylebone Library organised a room which was totally a reincarnation of Sherlock Holmes' room in Baker Street. And from that, about 11 people got together and restarted the society, which had to close down with the war. But as I say, it was reincarnated in 1951, and it's grown from a membership of 11 then to over 1,000 now, with a huge waiting list and about 6 science societies.
I've even got with me somewhere along the line a photocopy of Bradshaw's Railway Guide to September 1900, which proves conclusively that Coombe Tracy must be Totnes or vice versa, on account of the fact that the only train out of London which stopped at 5:40 p.m. anywhere in the region was at Totnes. So when Lestrade said arriving 5:40, he had to arrive at Totnes, didn't he?
I think most of us like looking at Victorian England through the eyes of Sherlock Holmes and Watson. I think it is another way of studying the history of that time in a much more interesting way.
Dartmoor today is little changed from the turn of the century when Conan Doyle wandered the moor seeking inspiration for his story with Harry Baskerville the coachman. Princetown, Grimpen Mire, and many other locations in the book can be traced. The legend, true or false, exists. But an investigation of the author himself and his life reveals many more sources for the novel. Conan Doyle had known the area 15 years before. His first medical practice was in Durnford Street, Plymouth, where he joined Dr. George Budd, who by all accounts was a charlatan.
Well, he was very ashamed of the practice because Dr. Budd used to take in patients free, but then prescribe these medicines for them, which they pay for. And altogether, he was so rude to his patients. And my father was really very ashamed of being part of this partnership.
So as a result of that, Conan Doyle really thought that this wasn't much good to him, and he hoped to get up to Tavistock. However, he went up there and had a look round on several weekends, and gloomily concluded, of course, that in Tavistock, that there were more doctors than there were patients anyway, and the undertakers were few and far between, so people obviously lived a frightfully long time. And so he came back to Plymouth, and more or less upstick then, and within 6 months went off to Southsea, where, of course, he then started to write his detective stories.
He gave me the impression that Dartmoor was rather like the ocean in a way, that on a lovely day it's beautiful, so serene, and then in a storm it can become very malignant. And I think that he was fascinated by this feeling of Dartmoor.
Conan Doyle wrote using his emotions about Dartmoor and his experiences. The prisoner who escaped while he was at the Duchy Hotel became part of the plot. But the prison may also have provided a far more important element. Ruth Murray lives a few miles from Princetown.
There would definitely have been bloodhounds either held at the prison or held by their owners and available if a criminal escaped onto the moor. In those days, criminals escaping from the prison wouldn't quickly manage to escape from the moor because they hadn't got the mobility they have now with cars and the M5, etc. And they might get away from the prison in thick mist on the moor, but then they would not themselves quickly find their way off the moor, and that's where the hounds would be brought in and laid onto them. Well, I think Dartmoor is a very mysterious place. It is even in this modern age, and certainly when you go further back when the roads weren't that open, and the public weren't so easily finding it accessible to them. It was a very mysterious place. It was a place that had always been hunted. It was a royal hunting forest at one time. People would hear these hounds hunting, even if you hear your local foxhounds today hunting the moor, especially in a mist. The baying of the hounds echoes all round the hills and tors, and it's very spooky.
My mind became paralyzed by the dreadful shape which had sprung out upon us from the shadows of the fog. A hound it was, an enormous coal-black hound, but not such a hound as mortal eyes have ever seen. Fire burst from its mouth, and its eyes glowed with a smouldering glare.
I think there were hounds, that some of them would be used against people. They were certainly used in America, bloodhounds were, and in Cuba, to trail escaped slaves. And the idea was not to catch the slaves, it was to catch up with them. And then if the slaves were killed, they couldn't care less. It was a lesson to anybody else not to do a runner, as it were. So I think there was almost that sort of fear thing. And in the West Country, certainly the large black hound, the black dog, there are places named Black Dog, has always existed. And I think that in turn would give rise to a legendary dog and then a ghost hound.
Today, tales of beasts roaming the moors abound. Whether Conan Doyle himself believed in them is hard to know, especially as accuracy was not his primary concern.
He wasn't meticulous at all. he wanted to write a good story. And if he was found out later and criticized for having made a mistake, he wasn't least bit worried, as long as he'd kept his readers happy. But I think he used his own experiences when he was young, but later on that he branched out and he was more imaginative.
The main theme of the novel is the villain's attempt to gain an inheritance. He hoped to kill off all the heirs to the Baskerville estate, leaving only himself to inherit. Some scholars have found clues to Conan Doyle's own life in the plot and other aspects of his books.
His attitude to his own father is a sort of lost inheritance because he couldn't really claim his father. His father suffered from epilepsy and was an alcoholic, was put into an asylum at the end of his life, and it was quite a sad 10 years that he spent in asylum, or in the Montrose asylum. And his father was still alive when Conan Doyle's fame as the writer of Sherlock Holmes. The father didn't die till 1893.
I personally think he was a slightly frustrated man in that he had to become a doctor. He'd had to study. He came from a family in Edinburgh. He was educated at Stonyhurst and had the toughest of tough public school educations. He would love to have been an adventurer himself.
My father did say that when an author created a character, there was always a little bit of himself in that character. And he said that, having said that, he realized that this went for Professor Moriarty too.
Perhaps too much can be read into a work of fiction. The Hound of the Baskervilles never existed, but it was a tale drawn from folklore and a little fact. And although the hound of literature may have died in a hail of bullets, for many people, hounds and beasts still inhabit the moor.
And now, my dear Watson, we've had some weeks of severe work, and for one evening I think we may turn our thoughts into more pleasant channels. I have a box for Les Huguenots. Might I trouble you then to be ready in half an hour, and we can stop at Marcini's for a little dinner?